We are the most connected generation in history, yet we're also the loneliest. But what if true loneliness wasn't about a feeling, but a physical reality? From plague houses to endless seas, this is how people survived a world without a lifeline. If you enjoy exploring these forgotten corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories about how our ancestors endured the unthinkable. In our hyper-connected world, loneliness is often described as a paradox. We have thousands of friends online, endless streams of content at our fingertips, yet many of us feel profoundly alone. But this modern ache is a ghost of what loneliness once was. Imagine a time before the telegraph, before the hum of a single engine, a time when the world was vast and the spaces between people were immense and often insurmountable. For our ancestors, loneliness wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical reality. It was the crushing silence of a winter storm cutting a village off for months, the stark isolation of an exile banished from everything they ever knew, or the quiet dread of a shepherd watching his flock on a desolate, empty moor. How did the human mind endure when faced with such absolute, crippling solitude? To survive, they didn't just need food and shelter. They needed to find ways to populate the silence and fend off the madness that waits within it. One of the most powerful tools against the abyss of loneliness was not physical but mental. The belief in an unseen world. For much of history, people lived in an enchanted reality, a world teeming with spirits, ancestors, saints, and demons. This wasn't just abstract theology. It was a daily, lived experience. A farmer alone in his field was never truly alone. He was in the company of the patron saint of his crop, under the watchful eye of God, and wary of the mischievous spirits that might lurk in the woods. These beliefs transformed the terrifying emptiness of the world into a crowded stage. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind could be interpreted as a message from beyond. This constant dialogue with the supernatural provided a kind of companionship, turning crippling silence into a conversation with the cosmos itself. It was a mental fortress against despair, populating the void with beings both benevolent and malevolent, ensuring that even in the most profound isolation, one was never truly without company. When belief wasn't enough, survival often depended on a more earthly savior, the relentless tyranny of work. For an isolated person, an empty schedule was a dangerous thing, allowing the mind to wander into the dark canyons of despair. The solution was a routine so demanding that it left little room for existential dread. Think of the solitary farmer, whose life was dictated not by whim, but by the sun and the seasons. There was always a fence to mend, a field to plow, or an animal to tend to. The same was true for the sailor on a long voyage, his hours marked by the changing of the watch, the scrubbing of the deck, and the endless repair of sails and ropes. This rigid structure was a bulwark against chaos. Each completed task, no matter how small, was a victory against idleness and a quiet reaffirmation of purpose. The physical exhaustion it brought was a gift, ensuring that sleep came not as a battle with one's thoughts, but as a welcome surrender. But even the most demanding routine could feel hollow without a human element. This drove people to find companionship in the unlikeliest of places, the animal world. A shepherd's bond with his lead sheep or his loyal dog was not just practical, it was a deep, emotional connection that stood against the silence. These animals were not mere property, they were confidants, recipients of mumbled conversations, worries, and hopes. They provided a living, breathing presence and an affection that asked for nothing but food and shelter in return. In the desolate quiet of the plains or mountains, the nuzzle of a dog's head or the steady, non-judgmental gaze of a goat could be the anchor that kept a person tethered to reality. This interspecies bond was a primal defense against loneliness, a simple, wordless relationship that could make an empty world feel, for a moment, full. When even animals couldn't fill the void, the literate few had another recourse, the written word. In an age of immense distances and slow, unreliable travel, a letter was not just paper and ink, it was a lifeline. It was a tangible piece of a loved one, a voice that could traverse oceans and continents to whisper in your ear. The anticipation of a ship carrying mail or a lone rider appearing on the horizon with a satchel was an agony of hope. The letter itself became a sacred object, its familiar handwriting a sight for sore eyes, its sentences read and reread until the paper grew soft and the creases wore through. For scholars, monks, and pioneers, correspondence created an invisible college, a community of minds that transcended physical separation. The very act of writing a letter was an act of defiance against isolation, a testament to the enduring human need to connect across a world of silence. But what of the vast majority of people throughout history who could not read or write? For them, the library was internal, a vast repository of memory and song. When all other company failed, people summoned it from within. They would recite epic poems learned by heart, tell and retell family histories, and trace genealogies back through the generations, populating the silence with the voices of their ancestors. Music was an even more powerful tool. A solitary weaver at a loom, a sailor coiling a rope, or a prisoner in a cell would sing. These weren't just idle tunes. They were stories, laments, and celebrations. Singing filled the empty air with human emotion, its rhythm a companion to the rhythm of their work. This inner world of inherited culture was a fortress, a way of carrying one's community inside oneself, ensuring that even when you were physically alone, you were never entirely cut off from the stream of human experience. There existed another form of loneliness, one born not of solitude, but of profound separation while being surrounded by others. This was the reality for sailors on a long voyage. A ship at sea was a crowded, claustrophobic world, a floating prison where privacy was non-existent. Yet this entire cramped society was adrift in an endless void of water and sky, utterly severed from the rest of humanity. The faces you saw on the first day were the only faces you would see for months or even years. This created an intense, almost familial bond, but also a unique form of isolation. It was a loneliness for the land, for the sight of a new face, for the sound of a voice that wasn't part of the same tired chorus. Their world was the ship, a tiny, self-contained universe whose inhabitants longed for nothing more than a reminder that a larger world and a life beyond the horizon still existed. In stark contrast to those who had loneliness thrust upon them, were the few who actively chose it as a sacred calling. These were the hermits and anchorites, spiritual athletes who saw solitude not as a curse, but as a crucible for the soul. They would retreat to a remote cave, a forest hut, or, in the most extreme cases, be walled into a small cell attached to a village church, never to leave again. Their goal was to strip away all worldly distractions, to communicate more directly with God.
Yet this was not a passive life. It was a disciplined existence of constant prayer and contemplation, a spiritual war fought on the battlefield of their own minds. And strangely, through their extreme isolation, they often became vital to their communities. People would bring them food and press their faces to a small slot in the wall, seeking wisdom, prayers, and a connection to the divine that only someone so thoroughly removed from the world could seemingly provide.
While some chose isolation, for others it was brutally imposed by fear and disease. The figure of the leper represents perhaps the cruelest form of social loneliness. Cast out from their communities, they were forced to live on the fringes, their existence a constant reminder of human fragility and the terror of contagion. In many places, they were compelled to carry a bell or a wooden clapper, not for their own benefit, but to warn the healthy of their approach, creating a moving circle of solitude wherever they went. The sound meant to protect others became the anthem of their own banishment. This was a loneliness compounded by physical suffering and the horror of seeing friends and family recoil from you. To endure this was to face a daily battle, not just against illness, but against the crushing psychological weight of being deemed untouchable by the whole of society, a ghost in your own world. At the opposite end of the social spectrum from the outcast, another more gilded form of loneliness existed, the isolation of the monarch. A king or queen lived at the very center of their world, perpetually surrounded by a sea of courtiers, petitioners, and servants. They were never physically alone, yet they were perhaps the most solitary person in the kingdom. How could one form a true friendship when their every word was law, and their favor could make or break a person's fortune? Every conversation was tinged with flattery, every relationship a potential transaction. They were a symbol, an institution, a crown, and the person beneath it was often lost. This was a loneliness born not of emptiness, but of a suffocating fullness, a gilded cage where authentic human connection was the one luxury they could never truly afford. The weight of the realm was a burden they bore in absolute solitude. Loneliness could also be a distinctly female experience, defined by the rigid structures of politics and family. Consider the fate of the noble bride, sent to a foreign land to seal an alliance. Often just a teenager, she would be uprooted from her home and transplanted into a court where she knew no one, did not speak the language, and was often viewed with suspicion as an outsider. Her husband was a stranger, her value tied directly to her womb and her ability to produce an heir. The familiar faces of her own attendants might be her only comfort, and even they could be dismissed on a whim. This was a profound cultural isolation, a silent existence in a world of alien customs and whispered intrigues. She had to navigate this treacherous new reality alone, constantly watched, constantly judged, and 1,000 miles from anyone who truly knew her. Another form of loneliness was not imposed by society, but by the land itself. This was the trial of the pioneer, the settler who pushed into the vast, seemingly empty frontiers of the world. Building a sod house on the Great Plains or a log cabin in a dense, silent forest, they were surrounded not by walls, but by a terrifying expanse of space. The sky was immense. The horizon was a razor-straight line that never seemed to get closer, and the silence was an active presence, broken only by the shriek of the wind.
Neighbors might be a full day's ride away, making the family a tiny, fragile island in a sea of prairie grass. This was a battle against insignificance, a daily struggle to impose a human scale on a landscape that was profoundly indifferent to their existence. To survive, they had to fill the emptiness not just with crops and fences, but with sheer force of will. Perhaps no figure better embodies the loneliness of responsibility than the lighthouse keeper. A voluntary exile, he was a living paradox, a beacon of hope for distant, unseen sailors, yet utterly alone himself. His world was a narrow stone tower, a tiny fortress of sanity against the chaotic fury of the sea. Day and night were governed by a sacred duty to keep the light burning, no matter the cost. His only companions were the rhythmic sweep of the great lamp, the cry of gulls, and the ceaseless roar of the waves against the rock. This was a solitude of immense consequence. A single mistake, a moment of lapsed attention, could doom a ship full of souls he would never meet. This weight, combined with the profound isolation, created a unique psychological test where the keeper had to become as steady and resilient as the stone tower he inhabited. Then there was the acute, shattering loneliness of the sole survivor. This was not a gradual descent into solitude, but a sudden amputation from the body of a community. It was the soldier left standing on a silent battlefield, the villager who was inexplicably spared by plague, or the castaway washed ashore from a wreck that claimed everyone else. Their world, once full of voices, was now an echo chamber of memory. Every object, every path, every empty chair was a testament to their loss. This was a loneliness haunted by ghosts and riddled with guilt, the gnawing question of, why me? To survive this was to learn to live in a world that had died, to carry the weight of an entire lost community within your own mind, and to find a reason to keep walking when everyone you ever walked with was gone. Not all isolation was born of geography or tragedy. Some was born in the mind itself. This was the loneliness of the visionary, the artist, the inventor, or the philosopher whose thoughts outpaced their era. To see the world in a way no one else did was to be fundamentally alone. Their passion was met with ridicule, their insights with suspicion, and their creations with blank incomprehension. They could walk through a bustling city and feel more isolated than a hermit in a cave, for they were surrounded by people with whom they could not share the most essential part of themselves. This drove them into a solitary existence, working late into the night in a dusty workshop or a candlelit study. Their only true companion was the work itself, the one thing that understood their vision. It was the profound loneliness that is often the price of genius. But perhaps the most terrifying form of loneliness was the one deliberately weaponized by other humans. This was the solitude of the dungeon, the absolute isolation of the prisoner. Here, loneliness was the punishment. Confined to a cold, dark cell, the world was stripped away until nothing remained but stone, dampness, and the prisoner's own mind. Time itself would dissolve into an endless cycle of darkness and faint light, the silence broken only by dripping water or the distant, muffled sounds of the world they lost. In this profound void, the mind could turn on itself, becoming a greater tormentor than any jailer. To survive was an act of supreme defiance. It meant finding companionship in a spider, creating a routine from nothing,
scratching days into the wall and holding on to the memory of a face or song as the last anchor to sanity in an ocean of absolute emptiness. Not all solitude was as dramatic as a dungeon or a shipwreck. Some was a quiet, creeping tide that came with age. This was the loneliness of the widow or the widower, left to navigate a world that was built for two. The house that was once a bustling hub of a shared life would fall silent, each room an archive of memories, each object a painful artifact of the person who was gone. The quietest moments became the loudest, the empty chair at the dinner table, the space in the bed, the lack of a familiar footstep on the floor. It was a life lived in the past tense, a constant conversation with a ghost. For elderly people, especially women who might lose their social standing along with their husband, this could mean fading into invisibility, their world shrinking, until it was contained within the four walls of a home haunted by a loving presence. There was also a loneliness pursued not for God or for survival, but for knowledge. This was the solitude of the naturalist, the cartographer, or the explorer who plunged into the world's uncharted corners. For months or years, their only society was the nature they sought to document. Their days were a meticulous, silent conversation with the world around them, hours spent observing the unfurling of a fern, sketching the anatomy of a strange bird, or painstakingly mapping a river's course. This intense focus was a powerful defense against the encroaching silence. Yet the isolation was immense. Every breathtaking discovery, every moment of sublime wonder was experienced in a vacuum, with no one to turn to and share in the awe. Their journal became their sole confidant, its pages filled with the observations and emotions that could not be spoken aloud, a silent record of a magnificent but deeply solitary journey. A more clandestine loneliness was the burden of the spy, the conspirator, or the revolutionary. This was an isolation that thrived in a crowd. To live a double life was to be perpetually alone, walled off from true connection by the very secret that defined your existence. You could laugh with friends, share a meal with family, and all the while your mind would be elsewhere, calculating risks and rehearsing lies. Intimacy was a liability, and genuine spontaneity a danger you could not afford. This was a loneliness of constant performance, a state of internal exile where you were the sole inhabitant of your own truth. Every interaction was a carefully managed play, and the actor beneath the mask was a ghost, unable to connect, unable to trust, and carrying the solitary weight of a cause that could cost them everything. Perhaps the most foundational loneliness of all was that of a child without a family. The orphan, the foundling, the workhouse resident, these children experienced an isolation that shaped their entire view of the world. They were often surrounded by other children, a sea of small faces in a vast, impersonal dormitory, yet they were profoundly alone. This was a loneliness defined by an absence, the absence of a mother's touch, a father's guidance, and the simple, powerful knowledge that you are the most important person in someone's world. Without that anchor, a child is adrift. They learn early that they can rely only on themselves, that affection is a scarce and conditional commodity. This wasn't a temporary state to be endured. For many, it was the very material from which their sense of self was built, a quiet solitude carried with them for the rest of their lives. On the fringes of many villages lived another solitary figure, one who was both essential and feared. This was the cunning woman, the healer, the hedge witch, the person you went to when official channels failed. Their loneliness was a paradox of proximity. They lived just beyond the edge of town, yet their knowledge of herbs, charms, and folk remedies made them intimately familiar with the community's secret troubles. People would seek them out under the cover of dusk for a poultice to soothe a fever or a charm to find a lost locket, sharing their deepest fears. Yet that same knowledge that made them necessary also made them suspect. They were the first to be blamed when the milk curdled or a fever did not break. This was a life lived in the doorway between two worlds, never fully trusted, never fully embraced, a lonely guardian of a community that held them at arm's length.
A different kind of solitude belonged to those who made their living from the crowd, the traveling players, the minstrels, the itinerant performers. Their lives were a paradox of fleeting connection. For one night they would be the heart of a village, the center of all attention, their music and stories a welcome fire in the darkness of rural life. They were celebrated, given food and drink, and for a few hours they felt like they belonged. But when the sun rose, they were expected to move on, their place in the community vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Their home was the road, their family a small troop or often no one at all. They were professional outsiders, collectors of stories from 1,000 towns, but having no single story of their own. It was the loneliness of the perpetual guest, always welcome for a night, but never truly home. Deep in the ancient forests lived another kind of solitary soul, the charcoal burner. His work was the slow, patient heart of industry, providing the fuel essential for blacksmiths and smelters. Yet it demanded an existence almost completely severed from that world. He would build his kiln, a great mound of earth and wood, and tend it for days on end, sleeping beside it, his life governed by the slow, smoky burn. His world was one of green twilight, his only companions the rustle of leaves and the patient crackle of the fire. When he finally emerged from the woods to trade his goods, he would seem a man from another time, smelling of smoke and earth, his eyes unaccustomed to the open sky. It was a profound seclusion, a life spent listening to the language of trees, so deeply immersed in the woods that he became a silent, watchful part of them. Another painful solitude was not chosen, nor was it a result of a specific job. It was the daily reality for anyone born with a significant disfigurement or crippled by injury. In a world that often saw deformity as a sign of sin or a divine curse, these individuals were set apart from birth. They navigated a landscape of averted eyes, cruel whispers, and outright mockery. Their loneliness was one of an ocean of people, of being perpetually on display, yet never truly seen as a person beyond their physical form. They were a walking spectacle, an object of pity or fear. To cope, many would retreat, finding comfort in the shadows or the quiet of the night, away from the relentless judgment of the day. They had to build a world within themselves that was whole and dignified, a sanctuary from a society that saw them as broken.
Then there was the sudden, horrifying loneliness of the plague house. When the pestilence came to a city, a red cross on the door and a guard posted outside was a death sentence for the family within. It was a swift and total severance from the world of the living. One day you were a part of the city's hum, the next you were sealed in a tomb with your loved ones, forced to watch as the disease you were locked in with claimed them one by one. The sounds of the healthy world outside, the laughter, the church bells, the rumbling of a cart would filter through the walls, a cruel reminder of a life you could no longer access. This was a solitude of shared doom, a small island of suffering in a sea of fear, where the greatest terror was not being alone, but the dread of who would be the next to go, and who would be the last one left.
Within the walls of monasteries, there existed a form of loneliness even more profound than that of the solitary hermit. It was the shared, deliberate silence of monks in certain austere orders. These men lived as a community, yet they took a vow to renounce speech, believing that words were a distraction from God. They would work together in the fields, pray together in the chapel, and eat together in the refectory, all without uttering a word. Each monk was an island of silence in a sea of silent brothers. Communication was reduced to a language of essential gestures. This was a radical commitment, an attempt to empty the self of ego and chatter to make room for the divine. It was a loneliness chosen not to escape others, but to escape the self, a silent, collective journey where each man walked his path to God utterly and completely alone.
There was also a loneliness that came not from a stone wall or an empty prairie, but from a wall within the mind. This was the solitude of the melancholic. In a time before the language of modern psychology, deep, persistent sadness was often seen as a spiritual failing, a humoral imbalance, or simple laziness. The person afflicted with melancholy saw the world through a dark, heavy veil. Joys seemed distant and pale, conversations felt exhausting, and the future held no promise. They were isolated by an invisible affliction that no one else could see or understand. Well-meaning advice to be of good cheer only deepened their sense of alienation. They were adrift in their own internal winter, present in body but absent in spirit, unable to feel the warmth of the world that everyone else seemed to inhabit so effortlessly. Through all these myriad forms of solitude, the prisoner's cell, the widow's quiet home, the pioneer's vast emptiness, a common thread emerges. To survive, the isolated mind had to learn to build a sanctuary within itself. When the external world offered no companionship, the inner world had to become a fortress, a cathedral, a bustling city of one. This was not mere daydreaming, it was a profound act of creation. It was the meticulous construction of routine in a void, the cultivation of conversations with God or with ghosts, the unfurling of epic memories and songs. This inner landscape, forged in the fire of extreme loneliness, became a source of immense resilience. It was in these silent, solitary spaces that a strength of character was hammered into shape, a resourcefulness that modern life, with its constant noise and distraction, rarely demands of us. This rich inner world, built as a defense, often overflowed into tangible creation. The profound solitude of the past was a fertile ground for artistry, not as a profession, but as a means of survival. The sailor on a 6-month voyage with nothing but the sea and sky would carve intricate scenes of home onto whalebone. The shepherd, alone on the hills, would carve a simple flute from a reed, giving a voice to the wind. Prisoners would scratch epic poems onto their cell walls with a shard of rock. These acts were a form of externalized memory, a way to make the inner world solid and real. They were a conversation with the future and a testament to the present. In the deafening silence of their lives, creating something, anything, was a way of shouting, "I am here," into the void.
And this brings us back to our own time. We have, in many ways, conquered the physical isolation that defined these historical lives. With the press of a button, we can speak to someone on the other side of the planet.
Our pockets buzz with the voices of 1,000 friends. Our quietest moments are filled with endless streams of entertainment. We have become experts at banishing silence. But in our flight from the pains of loneliness, one must wonder if we have also lost the gifts it once offered. Have we traded the deep, formative silence of the past for a shallow and constant noise? In ensuring we are never truly alone, have we forgotten how to be with ourselves? Perhaps the greatest challenge for the modern person is not how to survive loneliness, but how to dare to experience it at all.